Arts education has long been viewed as an asset for students, whether for academic performance, school climate, or community engagement. But a study for the learning nonprofit EdVestors sheds new light on the effects and who gets the most benefit. To tell us about the results is our guest from EdVestors, the Vice President for Programs and Equity, Ruth Mercado-Zizzo. Thank you very much for being with us, Ruth.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Ruth, one of the things that really helps this new study is that the arts programming being looked at has been going on for at least a full decade. So this is a study that shows the effects on students over time. What did we learn from that?
Yeah, I think one thing that we did learn was we always valued and sort of knew the intrinsic value of arts and arts education on young people. We've always believed in that. And one thing that was always missing when we've been in partnership with the district and in conversations we've had is, well, how do you know the work that you've been doing in arts education over the last 12 plus years is really having the impacts that you always say they did, that you mentioned just at the beginning, Chris. And this was an opportunity to really look at the change over time on individual students with increased access of the arts. And we really found that there was a measurable, significant increase in terms of student engagement, especially when it comes to looking at a reduction in absenteeism and on parent engagement and the ability of parents to feel more connected to a school.
Well, I want to ask you about the measure of attendance here, because you can look at it in two different ways that sound vastly different. By one metric, it comes down to, 1/3 of a school day for an entire school year for one student. But you can also look at this in the aggregate and say, well, it means 9 additional days for 25 students. What's the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, because when looking at a large sample size, something that we've learned in looking at over 600,000 student level observations over 11 years is that when you look at, our researchers also compared those absenteeism results next to actual interventions in the education space that are used in studies around how do you reduce absenteeism. And this was actually comparable or even more significant impacts on the reduction of absenteeism. And then the other thing that we really noticed was that the effect on chronic absenteeism and result in reducing the impact of students who are absent a lot, more than 10% every year, was pretty significant. And if we think about even just over the last year with the pandemic, student engagement has actually been a big challenge for schools and districts. And so showing that the arts can have a measurable impact on that is something that really stood out for us.
Well, good things sometimes have the biggest effect on people who have the biggest deficits. And that seems to apply here, because if you look at the effect on students who have disabilities or individualized learning plans, what about the effect as compared with other students?
Yeah, for students who have individualized education plans, or IEPs, as you mentioned, Chris, the effect was greater in terms of student engagement and absenteeism. And I think that might show that the arts give those students an opportunity to succeed in different ways that they might not get in doing sort of the traditional subjects in school.
Well, put that in the context of trying to provide those students with inclusion, because it's not just like juxtaposing them with other students. You want them to feel they're on par in some way, that they can feel good about themselves, even if they might struggle with certain other subjects.
I think it's more that they learn in different ways that might be easier for them to express themselves in an art space. We think about arts education as a great measure of students to express themselves and gain confidence. And I think maybe this sort of shows in a quantitative way the effects that can have on students who might struggle in other areas where you might not have as big an influence on student voice and things of that nature.
What about the effect on school climate and community engagement? I mean, it would seem those things might be harder to track with a study like this. What did you take away from that?
So we were able, because of our partnership with the district, through our BPS arts expansion effort, to really have the district share with us all the data they've collected over the last 11 plus years around school climate and parent engagement. And so they every year actually collect through parent and teacher and student reporting, a measure around school climate, and are people feeling comfortable in school? Are they connected to their communities? And by being able to put that next to the arts education and arts access data that we have and that the district has, and comparing them and seeing if there's a result through, a vigorous statistical analysis that our researchers conducted, that enabled us to really say, oh, parents actually do feel more connected in school. Teachers are reporting that parents and communities are more active in what is happening with their students if there is more arts available to them.
I want to ask you about the range of arts programming, because it's easy to suppose this includes, some sort of visual arts, how to paint and how to draw, or learning how to play the violin. But what about arts programming that can give the different cultures these students come from a presence in the school?
Yeah, so when we talk about arts education, we do talk about the disciplines that you mentioned, Chris: dance, theater, visual and media arts, and music, and also spoken word. And I would say the district over the last several years has really placed an emphasis on what are called culturally and linguistically sustaining practices, or basically curriculum that is reflective of the population of students that are in the classroom in BPS, which are majority students of color and economically disadvantaged students, and also really taking a closer look at the curriculum that is being taught to those students, and really revamping it to really amplify not just your traditional Western cultures, but all cultures, and especially BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices that typically aren't part of a traditional education.
I want to have you look back at the original decision, even if you weren't there when it was taking place, at EdVestors, to put all these resources into the arts, or at least to marshal all these resources. Do you still feel this is a worthwhile venture?
Absolutely. So we started this effort called BPS Arts Expansion in 2008, 2009, because as an education nonprofit, we really believed that every student deserved access to a well-rounded education. And we believe that arts was a powerful driver in terms of not just students' social emotional learning and positive youth development outcomes, but the other impacts that we've been talking about around student engagement, school climate and culture, and family and community engagement. And actually, it was originally supposed to be a 3-year effort with a number of different stakeholders, including funders, the city of Boston, and Boston Public Schools. And here we are 12 years later, because every 3 years, all those different partners have really looked at what we've accomplished and the impacts of the arts throughout the years, and decided that this is something that is extremely important and we must keep doing this work. And we've recently actually, with all those partners, agreed to continue BPS Arts Expansion for at least 3 more years.
Now, I would say over the past year, a lot of things in education have been curtailed or restricted in some way. And I imagine that includes the arts, but is there anything that to be learned from this past year about what needs to be done, maybe a little differently going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. I mean, in Boston, at least, I would say what was powerful about Boston is that even though most of the school year has been remote or hybrid, the arts still grew and continued to flourish throughout remote and hybrid school year. And one of the things that I think teachers and principals and students and parents really appreciated was during a really challenging year, not just due to the pandemic, but due through the sort of amplification of the racial injustice that's been ongoing in our country. The arts are a great way for students to express themselves, for students to process many of the things that have been happening in the news and in their lives. And it just gave them an outlet to also just feel connected to each other and to adults, even through a virtual platform.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
I really appreciate it, Chris. Thanks again for having me.
All right, and nice to meet you. That was Ruth Mercado-Zizzo from EdVestors. We'll have more news in just a moment.